Hello, and welcome to Horror Rewind. This is Kelly Florence, and this week we have a special episode dedicated to Meg's novel, Her Dark Inheritance. Just to let you know, this will be a spoiler-free episode. I won't give anything away about the book, and neither will Meg, but we will tell you a little bit about it. And then also, we'll be talking about Lizzie Borden and her lasting allure. Meg's debut novel, Her Dark Inheritance, is available now on Amazon for Kindle, or you can buy a hard copy, depending on how you like to read. And this is the description. On the day her mother died, Daphne Forrest learns the devastating truth. She'd never really known the woman who raised her, not even her real name. Fueled to unravel the tragic mystery behind her mother's secrets, Daphne abandons all she knows, traveling to the bucolic yet sinister town of Willoughby, Minnesota. Navigating through the memories of her own bloody legacy, Daphne throws herself into the insular and haunting small town of her ancestors. She investigates the murder that led to her mother's shame, aided by charming yet tortured local Edwin Monroe. Edwin has a unique understanding of the darkness in Willoughby and how the town holds a lurking threat more foreboding than any unsolved murder. As Daphne gets closer to the truth, Willoughby itself rebels against her. She bears witness to terrifying scenes from the past. Is her mother a murderer? Is that Daphne's dark inheritance? And is she strong enough to battle an evil more frightening than her own past? Well, that description sold me on reading the book, and I have to tell you, I enjoyed it quite thoroughly. There's a reference in the book, and I'm not giving anything away, because there is an axe on the cover, that there was an axe murder that took place in this fictional town of Willoughby, Minnesota. And the murderer or murderess is referred to as the Minnesota Borden. That's why the second half of this episode is set aside for the history of Lizzie Borden. I asked Meg a few questions about her writing and how she came to write this book. When did you first know that you wanted to write?
Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for asking these questions. And also, I want to apologize to everybody. I have a cold, so my voice sounds weird. Maybe it also sounds kind of sexy like this. I don't know. When did I first know I wanted to write? That's a really good question. And it's something, it's sort of cheesy to say, but I've just always wanted to. When I was a kid, I read a lot, and I think reading and writing sort of are a natural fit, and I think it's the people who read who want to write. And I remember, I tell this story a lot, when I was in first grade, I remember my dad exposing me to Shakespeare, and I listened to him read it. And I had never seen anyone love words that much before. Just the experience of him reading those words to me and sort of hearing the power of words was very transformative. I from that moment, wanted to create pictures with words. I can't draw at all. I can't draw a circle. So I guess it's really the only way I can do it. And I don't know, there's just something magical about writing. And so I wanted to do it forever. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to make it a career, but I knew that I would always write stories.
Do you remember the first story that you wrote? And if so, what was it about?
The first story I wrote, I can remember a story I wrote when I was 5 about a raccoon and a bear living together. I think it was a raccoon and a bear. I am trying to think. I remember writing sort of creepy stories. I remember writing a story about a black cat. I recall sort of getting into stories about, people who had gone through like bad things in their life. And it's funny because I sort of have combined those two things in what I do. I love to write scary stories, but I also like to write about people who have complicated pasts and have gone through shit. I mean, I think that we all like to read stories about people like that. It doesn't mean that it has to always be serious, but I like the idea of sort of taking horror and then taking real life horror, the things that we have to deal with and go through, and putting our characters through that. So it's kind of funny when I think back on the stories I used to write. It's sort of like I'm combining those things now.
What is it about Lizzie Borden that fascinates you?
Lizzie Borden. Okay. So I became fascinated with Lizzie Borden when I saw there was a movie made starring, I believe her name's Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched. I believe it was her. And she played Lizzie Borden. And I watched that movie with my mom when I was about, I want to say like 8. And before that, I was actually very interested in Helen Keller when I was little. And so I had like read every book I could about Helen Keller. I found her so interesting. And so it was sort of an odd jump from Helen Keller to Lizzie Borden because obviously they're sort of on two different spectrums. What fascinates me about her? Well, I've thought a lot about this because I do believe that my interest in her sort of has sparked a lot of my, well, obviously in Her Dark Inheritance, there are references to her, and she's just a big part of what I do, which I know maybe on the outside sort of sounds crazy, but I feel like Horror Rewind fans understand. You know what it was, I think, about Lizzie? And I guess people can argue that she's innocent, but I'm going to say that she's not, is that my whole childhood up until that point, I was used to women being the victims. And I mean, it's insane because obviously you can't look at Lizzie Borden as any sort of like, you know, guidepost of how you want to live your life. But I saw her as a person who's on the other end of the axe. Instead of being the woman that was being murdered, and she did murder a woman and a man, but instead of being on that side, she was on the other side. And I didn't even know that was possible. I had watched horror movies. I had, read some scary books by that point. And up until that point, I really don't think I knew that a woman could kill somebody or that a woman could be on that side of it. And that was, I hesitate to say empowering because we don't want to kill anyone, and that's not cool. But as a storyteller, that completely opened my eyes to the fascination of women as murderers, and why do women kill, and how is it different than why men kill. So Lizzie Borden will always be sort of a big inspiration in my work, and someday I hope to go to Fall River, Massachusetts, and go to her house and I fangirl. Can I say fangirl?
If you could have lunch with one person in Willoughby, who would it be, and what would you talk to them about?
Okay, this is a really good question. This question excites me. If I could have lunch with a person, oh my gosh. Okay, so my first instinct is to say Edwin because he's funny and charming and cute. And I mean, that doesn't hurt. Edwin is the male lead in the book. He's not the lead character, but he was in my short story collection as a teenager, and now he's in college and a little more grown up. And I love his character because he has this sort of affinity to save everyone. Like that's something that he sort of can't help about himself, and it kind of almost gets him in trouble in this book. And I sort of love that. I just sort of fell in love with him, and originally I was going to kill him off in the short story collection, and I just couldn't do it. Like I had to switch to killing off another character because I was just so in love with him. And the fact that Edwin is the only person of color who has grown up in Willoughby, which sounds insane, but I'm sure anybody who has been to a rural town in the Midwest would know that could be very true. Edwin just has this like very sort of outsider perspective, and he has this journalistic spirit. So he would be probably my first choice, and then my second choice would be my character Doris, because her brain doesn't always work so well. She's in her 80s, but Doris knows more about Willoughby than everyone, and she has like all these wonderful secrets. So I feel like she'd be really fun to sit down and have some lunch with.
What advice would you give to aspiring authors?
What advice? Okay, here's my advice if you want to be successful as an author. I would tell anyone asking that the only way really to have a novel I think that you could be proud of, that people will enjoy reading, and that will be a commercial success, is to accept that you can't do it by yourself, and that you need to accept and listen to other people's advice. It honestly takes a village to write a novel. I know that sounds crazy. And of course, my book is mine, and they are my characters and my ideas and my sphere of influence. But I would have missed out, and my book would not be as good if I didn't listen to my developmental editors and I didn't listen to my beta readers. It's hard to get your manuscript back with red marks all over it and people saying, no, you should change this and that. And you don't have to listen to every single thing. I mean, there are definitely things I stood my ground on. But when you write and you feel really good about a story, give it to somebody and ask their honest opinion, because they'll tell you, sometimes when you're writing, it's really like easy to sort of get caught up in things and be like, this is so good. And you don't realize it's confusing, and you don't realize maybe the pace isn't quite right. And that's where people you trust can really help you. And so my advice would be, open your ears. It doesn't mean you have to change your vision. Writing is art. And at the end of the day, it is yours and you have to be proud of it. But my advice is listen to advice. That's my advice.
If you had to live in a Stephen King novel as yourself, which book would you choose?
Okay. This is a really good question. This question makes me smile. The first one that came to me, and it's my favorite movie of all time, is The Shining. And I'm thinking of the movie, but the book, obviously, too. Here's what I want. I want to live at the Overlook, just less ghosts, maybe. And, because let's be honest, if your job was to go watch a hotel, like a whole big hotel for the winter, like that sounds amazing. I mean, the only problem is, of course, is if I'm going to live there, I guess I have to deal with the ghosts and like the murder and stuff. So maybe that's not a good one to choose. How about The Stand? Like, I don't know. Sometimes it's just like, it's like the whole thing with The Shining and like living in a hotel and not having to do anything and not having to be social. The Stand's kind of like that too, where like if you just live in like a nice little area and you didn't get sick, you didn't get the virus, and your loved ones didn't, like that could be a pretty good deal. Maybe these are terrible ideas. There's no like nice Stephen King novel that I can think of where everything is good and hunky-dory. But who wants to live in that, right? That's why we read these books, because we imagine what it would be like being in that situation. So those are my two examples. I know after this I'm going to be like thinking of things that other novels, and I'm going to be like, why didn't I say that?
Where and when can everyone find Her Dark Inheritance?
Okay, so I'm very excited. If you can't tell, I'm very excited about Her Dark Inheritance. And you can buy it right now on Amazon. It is available on Kindle. It's available in paperback. Also, I'm going to be sort of all around the country, well, especially in Minnesota, my home state, and I'll be in Texas a lot, and I'll be in Chicago. So if you want a signed copy, and you want to meet me and chat horror, I have lots of events coming up, and Kelly will be with me too. But you can check out my website. You can go to Amazon and search my name, or you can search Her Dark Inheritance. It has a big axe on the cover, so it's hard to miss. And you guys, like, I would love your support. And, you know, this is my debut novel, and I'm so excited about it, and I just want to share it with everybody, and the people who've read it have given me such good feedback, and I would just love to know what you think about it. And yeah, so you can find Her Dark Inheritance pretty much everywhere, and I'm sure I'll be bugging you about it on Horror Rewind in the future. I'll try not to too much, though. Thanks, guys, for listening, and thank you, Kelly, for all the great questions.
Hi, horror friends. Lisa here. And today we're going to make a drink to celebrate our dear friend Meg and the release of Her Dark Inheritance. It's a drink I'd like to call Daff Smash. It's my twist on the classic Smash cocktail. And let's make this drink. Our ingredients we'll need today include fresh mint. Obviously, it's Daff's go-to, maybe in candy form, but we want the fresh stuff here. Also, some 7-Up. To honor our friend Moira. Lemon juice, it's a staple in the Smash. Lingonberry preserves. Lingonberries are a Scandinavian go-to, and if you've ever been to Minnesota, there are a few people of Scandinavia there, and you can find preserves at IKEA. You can also find them on Amazon. It's sort of like a lingonberry, Lingonberry. Lingonberry is sort of like a cross between a cranberry and a blueberry. It's delightful. Finally, we're going to need some vodka. If you are able to find Prairie Organic vodka, that's ideal, as it is distilled in Minnesota and a final tribute to Willoughby. If not, your vodka of choice will work as well. All right. We are also going to need a lowball glass, some crushed ice if you have it, our muddler, and our shaker. Let's get started. So at the bottom of the glass, we're going to tear up 12 fresh mint leaves. Everything is going to smell delicious. Get ready. Put those in the bottom of your glass. Go ahead and grab 2 tablespoons of the lingonberry preserves, a half an ounce of the lemon juice, and a half an ounce of the 7-Up. Go ahead and grab your muddler and get in there. Muddle it for about 30 seconds. This is really going to help release the mint flavoring throughout. Once you are good and muddled, go ahead and grab your crushed ice, fill the glass, and add 2 ounces of vodka. Now we're going to go ahead and grab our shaker. We're not doing a full shake because of the carbonation in the 7-Up, but let's just pour it back and forth once or twice to really saturate the flavor. And then once you have it back in the lowball glass, go ahead and top it with a little bit more 7-Up and give it a stir. Grab the top of your mint sprig to garnish this. It will look beautiful. And go ahead and raise the glass, and let's cheers our friend Meg and congratulate her on this delightful, delightful horror book. Cheers, Meg. Cheers, friends. Enjoy.
According to an article by Elizabeth Yuku, it didn't take long after Lizzie Borden was accused of murdering her father and stepmother for the public to start obsessing over the case. Newspaper coverage began immediately after that hot August day in 1892 and centered on the fact that a prim, proper, church-going woman in Fall River, Massachusetts, may have brutally killed 2 members of her family with a hatchet. Lizzie was acquitted in June 1893, and that acquittal only stoked the interest in her and the murders, and that interest has never really died down. There are all sorts of people interested in the Lizzie Borden case. There was a couple that got married as Lizzie Borden and a detective. They dressed up like that. The house where the murders took place is set to be open to the public. I believe it already is open and you can tour it. And there's even Lizzie Borden's meatloaf recipe that you can find and create for yourself. There is, of course, the ubiquitous Lizzie Borden took an axe schoolyard chant. If you're familiar with it, it goes, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Now, just to clarify, it was actually Lizzie's stepmother, and she suffered 18 or 19 blows while her father suffered 11. Still not pleasant, but a lot less than the 40 that are in the rhyme. In 1954, Agnes de Mille put on a ballet called Fall River Legend about the Lizzie Borden murders. 1965, there was an opera entitled Lizzie Borden, and there's a rock opera that is out currently called Lizzie, the musical, and it's actually going to be performed here in Duluth, Minnesota, coming up this summer. There was a 1975 made-for-TV movie called The Legend of Lizzie Borden, and then if you remember a few years ago, there was one starring Christina Ricci called Lizzie Borden Took an Axe. They also followed it with a series called The Lizzie Borden Chronicles. Now, coming out this year in 2018, we do have a movie updating about the Lizzie Borden case, starring Chloe Sevigny as Lizzie Borden and Kristen Stewart as Bridget Sullivan, who is the family maid. So some facts about the case. It was an oppressive heat wave in August of 1892, and the two people who were murdered, Andrew and Abby Borden, received multiple blows to their heads with a hatchet. The only serious suspect was Andrew's 32-year-old unmarried daughter, Lizzie, who was at home during the killings. His other daughter, Emma, was out of town, and their live-in maid, Bridget Sullivan, was in her third-room floor, resting from a morning of window washing and vomiting following the consumption of spoiled mutton stew. Now, this spoiled mutton stew has become part of the investigation. They actually checked the contents of the victims' stomachs to see if they could have been poisoned, but they think it just went bad because of the heat. The finer details of the murders were hazy from the beginning, starting with thousands of curious townspeople who visited the crime scene and unintentionally ended up tampering with evidence. Also, Lizzie's testimonies themselves were inconsistent. Now, she was given morphine after the murders occurred to help her calm her nerves. It's not just the act of murder, though, that keeps us coming back well over a century later. What separated this from other crimes was the combination of an unlikely suspect, the rise of sensationalized journalism, and the fact that it offered a morbid and wry critique of high society. And we have never lost interest. According to Richard Behrens, he hosts the Lizzie Borden podcast. He said, I think we're still fascinated by the case to this day, largely because it has all the elements of a Greek tragedy or a Victorian melodrama, and the fact that the case is unsolved gives it cultural longevity. Lizzie Borden has been elevated to an American tragedy at the same level as the sinking of the Titanic. Now, there have been many theories regarding Lizzie's potential motives. Some people speculated maybe she was a victim of incest. There was no proof of this, but they had figured days earlier, before the murders, her father had killed her pet pigeons with a hatchet himself, so maybe she was angry because of that. Or she was sick of his strict and rigid ways. It was rumored that she didn't really like her stepmother. She called her Mrs. Borden and didn't really interact with her much. None of them can be proven, of course, but it just adds to the mystery surrounding this case. Lizzie's was one of the first trials in American history that both fueled and was fueled by major mass market newspapers and magazines. She was also a media sensation because her trial exposed the sleazy shortcomings of high society, delighting the poorer masses. Now, Dr. Jean Kim, who is a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at George Washington University, said that a memorable historic murder highlights a particular social insight or reality that society has repressed or ignored until that moment. The Borden murders, she suggests, reflect a key moment in our modern public consciousness about the reality of violence in private families, even ones that seem outwardly affluent or normal. She also cites other cases of note, including Jack the Ripper, which highlighted the underbelly of prostitution and the contrast between their social class and their sometimes surprisingly well-to-do customers, and even in more modern times, the O.J. Simpson case, which drew attention to issues of racial perceptions of the police, the invulnerability of celebrity, and domestic violence, even in a wealthy household. Murders that stay in the public imagination often are bellwethers or signposts or precedents for key moments in our collective social consciousness, Dr. Kim said. They are events that challenge the status quo for good and resist prior covering up of shameful repression, or they shock societal norms, confirm our worst fears about ourselves, or reflect the anxieties of the era they occur in, which we can look back upon with more objectivity. Now, in the Borden case, back in 1892 and 93, this is when the media used that trial to convey that the wealthy are not exempt from unsavory or violent behavior. It wasn't just poor people. Lizzie's defense was, in some ways, a defense of upper-class society, an attempt to demonstrate that someone from her background could not have possibly committed a brutal murder. Now, this clash of ideologies and opposing narratives made for compelling copy, and newspapers and the public ate it up. Imagine being alive at that time and being able to read about this. Once the media created Lizzie Borden as a persona and she became a celebrity, the process was self-sustaining. The more she was a household name, the more newspaper people would purchase. Now, just like gossip magazines of today and maybe some other news outlets, the newspapers then often took liberties when reporting the facts. Because the case and trial had so many easily sensationalized components, very dramatic accounts of what happened in the courtroom were often reported. For example, when Lizzie fainted at the sight of her father and stepmother's severed heads, which were brought in as evidence, and by the way, side note, their heads were removed during the autopsy process. So they brought in these severed heads and she fainted. On slower news days, reporters would comment about Lizzie yawning or looking bored during the trial and planting the seed that a woman exhibiting boredom by such a gory event might be capable of murder. Her every move made headlines, but that still doesn't explain why we still pore over the evidence in search of something new. There is a Lizzie Borden museum and bed and breakfast, which is the family home. It actually is reconstructed to look just like it did when the murders took place. Visitors can take a guided tour of the house, visit the gift shop, and also where the barn once stood. You can stay overnight in Lizzie's bedroom or in the room where Abby was murdered. One interesting note about this murder, and something that people speculate why people were so interested in the murder, is that a hatchet was used, and in order to kill your victim, you had to be up close and personal and wield a lot of strength. Now, at the time, poison was the method of choice for most female Victorian killers, and so it's fascinating to people that a woman could have committed these murders. According to investigative journalist and true crime expert M. William Phelps, the case's voyeuristic magnetism stems from the fact that Lizzie Borden may have pulled off the perfect crime, literally getting away with murder, and that we like that version of the story better than the alternative. It's more fascinating, comforting, and compliant to the crash and burn on live TV society that we live in today to accept that a young woman murdered her parents, he says. We expect it. Lizzie is the perfect archetype like Jodi Arias or Casey Anthony. Our obsession exists because we're simultaneously scared of and fascinated by death as long as it happens in someone else's community and even someone else's era. Lizzie Borden, it is said, is to be as much a part of American mythology as Paul Bunyan. When she was released from prison, she chose to remain a resident of Fall River, Massachusetts, despite being ostracized from the community, and she lived until the age of 66. She died on June 1st, 1927. What do you think? Do you think Lizzie Borden is guilty? Have you seen any of the films or made-for-TV episodes of shows that focus on Lizzie Borden? To name a couple, there is an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents called The Older Sister. There's also an episode of Supernatural that focuses on Lizzie Borden called Thin Lizzie. And even an episode of The Practice had a defendant who believed she was Lizzie Borden in a past life. If you, too, are fascinated by Lizzie Borden, I would highly recommend that you check out Meg's novel, as the killer in the book, as I mentioned, is referred to as the Minnesota Borden. It has some similar themes. Thank you for joining us for this special episode of Horror Rewind. I hope you have a great week, and until next time, we'll see you in the horror section.